Welcome back. Here we are at the end of Purgatory, and we've finished the final cornice, the lustful, and now we are entering into the earthly paradise for the last 6 cantos of Purgatory, and there we're finally going to get to see Beatrice, who's going to be so happy to see Dante. Kind of. Bum 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 bum, Purgatorio, ba bum 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 bum. Before we begin, I'd like to also point out another resource I've been using lately. I have another version of Purgatorio, which is the Longfellow translation. It's the easiest translation to find. You find it all over the place, and I don't usually read it because Longfellow had some odd syntax as he translates the poem. He kind of keeps the Italian syntax in a lot of places, and he uses a lot of archaic language. So it's a challenge to read. It's good for another version to look at, but I don't usually consistently read it. But this particular edition has some great notes by Peter and Julia Bondinella, and they are kind of like charty in a lot of ways, but they're a little bit more meticulous. He is absolutely brilliant though, so I really enjoy his notes and rely on his notes very heavily. But it's nice to get a second opinion sometimes. So, as we conclude Purgatorio, we come to the garden, the earthly paradise. And it starts out actually with Dante in Canto 28, walking through a wood. And the wood sounds, or at least sounds like an echo. It's easy to make a comparison with the dark wood at the very beginning of the Inferno. That one, Dante was wandering through a wood and he was lost and he was helpless. Now he's come all the way through this purification process and he's finally entering the end. He's seen all of the failure, he's gone through all of the correction of failure, and here as he approaches the actual divine and the sublime, he is crossing through a wood again. It sort of seems to have come circle, which is a very symbolic and Dantean kind of thing. And also we see that Dante is actually in control of his own steps now. Remember how Virgil gave him permission to go his own way as they entered this final area. And Dante is going to walk in front, and Virgil and Statius are going to walk behind. And from time to time, Dante is going to turn back and look at them. In fact, he does it 3 times, but he never receives any further guidance or information from them. There's in fact something of a progression, as the first time he turns back to Virgil, Virgil is smiling, sort of affirming what he's looking at. The second time, Virgil is overawed. He is overwhelmed by the vision as much or more than Dante, who is closer to it and therefore understands it better. And finally, Virgil is going to be gone altogether. And so there's this sort of progression away from Virgil throughout these. He comes upon a garden, and in the garden are 2 streams. And there, walking on the other side of the first stream, the first river, is a woman, and she is singing. And Dante is very interested in this, and so he approaches and calls out to her. He can't cross the river yet. That's coming. But he calls out to her and speaks to her for a moment. And this garden imagery is very significant. We knew it was coming. We already had hints of it. But this is the Garden of Eden. This is the lost Garden of Eden, because it was shut off from humanity after the fall of man. And only once people have been purified and made perfect again can they again enter into the Garden of Eden. So they have to go through the whole purification process, the purging of purgatory, before they can finally arrive again at the beginning, the pre-fall perfection. And so, although the entire purgatory is sort of a moving forward towards through a process towards perfection, there's also this sense of returning to something that we once were, that we could have been before the fall of man and before sin entered. And Dante calls out to her, and we see this a lot of imagery of this pre-fall, this perfection, this spring sort of imagery. In fact, he calls her a Persephone. A Persephone who comes before the fall of Persephone, before Hades drags her down into the underworld. So this is in the world of eternal spring. This is the Persephone of innocence. If you remember the myth of Persephone, she was this beautiful goddess of spring. Her mother was sort of the goddess of harvest. Ultimately, but Hades dragged her down into the underworld. She ate some of the fruit there, and so from now on she has to spend some time in the underworld and some time in the world above, which gives us the cycle of seasons. While she's in the underworld, the world is cold and dark and wintry, and her mother Demeter has to teach the people how to harvest during that time. But then in the time when she's free, she's able to wander the world, and we have plenty, and we have spring, and we have life again. Dante feels the urge to cross this river, but he doesn't exactly know how yet. In fact, he's not going to be allowed to cross for a few more cantos. And he also is wondering how this world seems to function, because here we have this sort of natural world where we have this flowing stream. Where's the stream come from? And we have this very pleasant breeze blowing on him. Where does that come from? How does this world function if there is no weather up here? Because remember, we heard before that the weather kind of stops at the gates of Purgatory. So how does this work? I mean, how can this water be replenished without rainfall and cycles like that? And we discovered that from this lady who is Matilda, we'll find that out by the end of the book, we discovered that these things are constant. They are pure and perfect, therefore they don't go through the changing cycles of weather, but rather they flow from the perfect will of God. And so therefore they are constant and perfect. Everything in the Garden of Eden emphasizes perfection, so everything is emphasized as being perfect, everything is emphasized being constant and changeless. And also, there is every kind of seed ever here. All things grow here because of the true essence of the plants, not because of seeding and planting and growing, but their nature is just implanted in the ground, and so all things are able to grow here in this perfect world. She points out what these two rivers are. The first is Lethe, or Leth, as I sometimes accidentally pronounce it. It is the river that we know from mythology of forgetfulness, and here, as we talked about when we were back in the Inferno, here it is to help the sinners forget their past sins. It wipes away the slate of their past sins that they've been carrying all the way up to this point. And then it drains back down into the Inferno, and so the sins sort of wash away down there. The second river is Inoue, which is a river of reminding us of the good. And so, first of all, we're purged of the bad, and then replenished with the good. You have to drink them in that order. And she explains also the placement of the Garden of Eden, how this is its original place. The two rivers also remind us of the rivers that are mentioned in Genesis, talking about the Garden of Eden, how there's the Tigris and Euphrates, and sort of these represent those two rivers as well. And Dante turns back for sort of confirmation of all of this for Virgil, and Virgil goes, but he doesn't say anything. So this is the first of 3 times he turns back to Virgil. That brings us to Canto 29, when all of a sudden this huge pageant comes, and it's very elaborate. Okay, this is a point I don't want to spend too much time on, but Dante veers into extremely strong allegory. He's always been very symbolic all the way up, but he's subtle about it, and he blends these two kinds of allegory. He blends, right, the theological allegory with the poetic allegory, which we've talked about in the past. But at this moment, instead of blending this historical and this very mythological symbolic allegory, he really starts to layer on the symbolism. And it really helps if you have something of a grounding in a lot of the symbolism of Revelation. That's really heavy. A lot of the medieval scholars and the symbolism that they used. If you've ever been to a cathedral and looked at the windows and walls of a cathedral, you'll sort of get the same impression that this pageant puts forward. It's a way of telling all the important theological ideas in symbols. If you've ever been to a cathedral and you look up at the windows, you see how each pane of glass in the windows tells a story, and how each little sculpture, which covers the whole cathedrals, if you've ever been to like a Gothic cathedral in Europe, they are just covered with sculpture everywhere, and everything is extremely symbolic. If you go up to the front of a cathedral, usually there's 3 doors there to represent the Trinity, and over each door is a set of sculptures. Maybe these are the apostles, and these are the prophets, and each little bit is deeply symbolic. Well, we get that same sort of feel here. This is a pageant. So it's not the actual figures, but it's people representing those figures coming down. This huge parade with a chariot drawn by a griffin, and everything is extremely symbolic. It's so complicated that I'm not going to spend time going through each of the things, but you have the apostles, you have all the books of the Bible, you have these 7 lampstands that are in Revelation, you have all these different figures. Of them all, there's a few that are going to keep recurring and be pretty significant. Of course, the griffin is huge. The griffin is pulling the chariot, and the griffin represents Christ in its 2 natures, just as Christ is both man and God at the same time. The griffin is bi-natured. It's both a lion and an eagle at the same time. Okay, we also have the chariot, which represents the church, and Beatrice, who's riding in the chariot, both represents divine love, but she also, in this place, represents the bride, the church, who's coming to be wed to Christ. And so there's a lot of symbolism there. On either side of the chariot, there is a group of nymphs. There are 4 nymphs on one side and 3 on the other side, and those represent the virtues. And since we've spent so much time sort of recapping the virtues as we go up, the virtues are going to be very significant as well. And we're going to keep seeing them over and over again. So the four cardinal virtues, the philosophical virtues, and the three theological virtues, the Christian virtues. Both of those are going to be really important, and we're going to talk about, as we go through the next couple cantos, how they lead Dante towards Beatrice, and how they've supported Beatrice throughout this time, and how they are necessary to the cleansing and the guidance of Christians up to this point. Okay, so there's just a couple more things I want to point out about this pageant before I go into the actual meeting of Beatrice. First of all, that Dante is going to begin to have some difficulty describing what he sees. Similar to the end of the Inferno, where things became more and more sublimely evil, and as he viewed them, he began to consider the ineffability of what he was seeing. It's undescribable. There aren't words for it. He's going to have a similar experience here, and a lot of what he describes, he's going to sort of talk about how he's not able to do it. He's going to veer away from perfect descriptions. A good example of that is Beatrice's smile. He doesn't actually describe her smile. He says she's smiling, and then he describes his reaction to it in detail, but he can't describe her smile because it's too great. That's coming in a minute. But also this whole description of everything here, he talks about, oh, it's too much, I can't describe it all, let me move on to something else here, let me move on to a different detail because this is just too much for me. So there's that ineffability, which emphasizes perhaps the poet's humility, that this is beyond the grasp of poetry, but also just generally, this is so great and so wonderful, it's beyond the grasp of language. Also, this is the second time Dante turns back to Virgil. He's seeing the pageant, it's amazing, and he turns back to Virgil to see how Virgil's reacting, waiting sort of for Virgil's explanation, as he usually gets, and Virgil has no explanation here. Virgil is staring, just awed and dumbstruck by it all as well. So Virgil's gone from smiling about things to just being overawed by it all. Virgil is less and less important to Dante with each step. Dante, in fact, here calls out to the muses and asks all of the muses to help him describe that this is big. I need the help of all the muses. So again, he's relying on heavenly power and a power outside of himself to lead him to describe this, not his own personal power. In Canto 30, all of a sudden the pageant has just stopped, and they turn and they call out to the chariot, and they're summoning the bride. Or in this case, it's actually Beatrice. They're summoning Beatrice off of the chariot to see Dante. Come, bride from Lebanon, and they call out, blessed is he who comes. And then they call out, give lilies with full hands. So each of these is a Latin statement. The first two are from the Bible. One is from the Song of Songs or Song of Solomon. The second one is from Matthew. But the third one is from the Aeneid. And so we have these three statements, all of them recognizing the glory of Beatrice as she arrives. But the first two are biblical. The third is like a final tribute to Virgil, right before Virgil disappears, because this is our farewell to Virgil. And that's kind of special. So they're celebrating the arrival of Beatrice, and she steps off of the chariot, and she's wearing this partial veil, which is going to be important in a moment. But as she steps down, she's also dressed in colors that represent the three theological virtues, faith, hope, and love. And here she arrives, and Dante sees her for the first time, and it's amazing! The instant I was smitten by the force which had already once transfixed my soul before my boyhood's years had run their course, I turned, left with the same assured belief that makes a child run to its mother's arms when it is frightened or has come to grief, to say to Virgil, there is not within me one drop of blood unstirred. I recognize the tokens of the ancient flame. So Dante's awed by it, and the first thing he wants to do is be like, hey Virgil, look, it's because Virgil's gone. And so this is the third time he looks back to Virgil. He looks back to Virgil to tell him, hey look, it's Beatrice. And Virgil's not there anymore. Virgil's gone. And so all his thoughts about Beatrice are instantly gone, because Virgil's been his dear, close friend and father figure all the way through this. He was his father in poetry, his mentor in poetry. He's also been his guide all the way through both the Inferno and Purgatory, and here he is gone. And Dante forgets Beatrice for a moment and begins to weep over the loss of Virgil. So the first thing that Beatrice actually says to Dante is, Dante, do not weep yet, though Virgil goes. Do not weep yet, for soon another wound shall make you weep far hotter tears than those. So, after missing Beatrice for 10 years, she's been dead for 10 years, and he finally gets to see her. We've been waiting all this time to see her, and the first thing she does is, you think you're sad now, I'll give you something to cry about. It's really maybe unexpected. And in fact, for the next two cantos, she's going to berate Dante for his inattention to her in all those years that she was gone. I find this kind of humorous. I know it's deeply symbolic and important, but it's also kind of funny. You know, you miss somebody for 10 years and you're so happy to see them, and instead of being happy to see you, they're like, "Psh, didn't you think about me the whole time? What was wrong with you? Why are you so late?" And Dante's like, "I just went through hell and purgatory for you. I don't care." She continues and says, "Look at me well. I am she. I am Beatrice. How dared you make your way to this high mountain? Did you not know that here man lives in bliss?" Here Dante is weeping over the loss of Virgil, and Beatrice is going to get on to him. Not just for that, but for something much more extensive. And Dante, instead of looking at her, looks down at the stream. But he sees himself, the reflection of himself, which reminds him of his sin. Therefore, he can't even look at the stream, he has to look at his feet. He says, "I shrank as a wayward child in his distress, shrinks from his mother's sternness. For the taste of love grown wrathful is a bitterness." This is the second time we've seen sort of this parallel between Dante as a child and Beatrice as a mother. So we see that sort of similar to Virgil as a father and Dante as the child. But it's very different. She is a wrathful mother. She's a mother who is stern and correcting because of his fault. Doesn't mean she doesn't love him, but he's made a mistake and he needs to be set right first. See, back in 44 he says, he compares himself to a child that's running to its mother's arms, but here he's a child who's shrinking from his mother's sternness. It's quite a reversal from his first thought of seeing Beatrice. It's like, "Oh," and then she yells at him and he's, And he talks about being frozen and unable to even reply. And all the other angels and all these characters in this pageant are like, "Whoa, whoa, she's savage." And actually Beatrice has to turn around and explain to them why she has to be harsh with Dante. And that takes up the rest of this canto. "Lady, why do you treat him in this fashion?" they say. And she says, "I must speak with greater care that he who weeps on that far bank may understand and feel a grief to match his guilt. Not only by the workings of the spheres that bring each seed to its fit and end according to the stars that ride above it, but by gifts decreed in the largesse of overflowing grace, whose reign has such high vapors for its source, our eyes cannot mount to their dwelling place. This man potentially was so endowed from earthly youth that marvelous increase should have come forth from every good he sowed. He had such potential when he was younger. When he saw me, that good was sort of planted in him, and he had that great potential. And as long as he was looking at me, he was directed towards the good." It's a sort of connection back to Dante's early life, the Vita Nuova and all of that. When she died, then Dante lost sight, and he started trusting in his own philosophy too extensively instead of trusting in divine love. And because he lost sight of Beatrice, both literally, because she was dead, and also symbolically, he was no longer guided by divine love, but instead by philosophy. He didn't have his greater love in its place. As we've seen all throughout Purgatory, that's the point of Purgatory, putting divine love first. He didn't do that, and therefore he has cause to grieve now. Before he can fully turn back to divine love, before he can fully be cleansed, he has to realize the extent of his guilt and actually be grieved over it. So he can't just saunter in here into eternal paradise and be like, "Yeah, everything's fine. I made a mistake, but who cares?" He has to really understand his mistake. And then he has to confess and repent before he can fully be forgiven. And we're going to see that's part of the next process. And that is what she's pushing him towards, like a good mother who's stern, tough love. He turned his steps aside from the true way, pursuing the false images of good that promise what they never wholly pay. The false images of good. So he turned himself away from the greater good for lesser good. And that's really the problem that we see throughout Purgatory. Not all the inspiration I won by prayer and brought to him in dreams and meditations could call him back, so little did he care. He was distracted too much by his poetry, by his pride, by his philosophy, and he didn't see the greatness of divine love. So in Canto 31, she turns away from the angels, who she's been explaining this to, and turns to Dante and really lays it on him and asks him to confess, which is part of that process, repentance and confession, before he can be forgiven. Speak up, is it true? To such a charge, your own confession must give evidence." And so Dante has great difficulty in confessing. He has great difficulty in letting this out. He sort of moves his mouth a little bit, but his voice dies in his throat, he says. She says, "Speak up, for the waters have yet to purge sin from your memory." So he still hasn't drank from Lethe, right? And so he still has the sin on him. He still has it there to confess. He needs to get it out. And he finally says, "Yeah, I did. And she says, "So what got in your way? What made you forget me? What huge obstacles were laid out for you, what huge enticements were laid out for you that kept you from the good way, that kept you from loving me and from divine love. In tears I said, the things of the world's day, false pleasures and enticements, turned my steps as soon as you had ceased to light my way. And she points out that a grown, mature person would not have failed so much. She says, you were acting like a fledgling. A true bird would have avoided such snares. And then she jabs him by commenting upon his beard and saying, lift up your beard and look at me. Sort of, she could have just said lift your chin, but she points out the fact that he has a beard because he's a man. I'm a man. I can grow a beard. As opposed to baby me, who couldn't grow a beard, who made lots more mistakes than I do, theoretically. So when you're a kid, it's easy to make mistakes, but once you're grown and mature and bearded, you ought to be able to see the right way. You're grown up. And he's really stung by that beard comment. I sense too well the venom of her phrase. When I had raised my eyes with so much pain, I saw those primal beings now at rest, who had strewn blossoms round her thick as rain, and with my tear-blurred and uncertain vision, I saw her turned to face that beast, which is one person in two natures without division. Even veiled and across the river from me, her face outshone its first self by as much as she outshone all mortals formerly. And the thorns of my repentance pricked me so that all the use and substance of the world that I had loved now most appeared my foe. Such guilty recognition gnawed my heart, I swooned for pain, and what I then became she best knows who gave me cause to smart. And so it's the actual turning and looking at her that opens the wound and cures it. So he has felt the sin of it, he's confessed it, and he's looked to love. And when he looks to love, he truly feels the grief of his pain. And he sees the difference between all the false loves he held on to, all the lesser loves, and the greater love that is in her. And so if he had just kept his eyes on her the whole time, things would have been a lot better. And all those lesser things suddenly seem so much less significant. It's the big theme of Purgatory, right? Less love versus greater love. But notice that swooning scene there is very much compared to the swooning scene we saw at the end of Inferno, when he sees Satan. That's kind of a different thing. He uses similar words at the end of Inferno when he sees Satan and he swoons. Here he is seeing her and swooning. You recognize what I became there, is sort of what he says in both places. And so there's parallels between the two. This time he's swooning because of his own sin, and the grief of his own sin, and the greatness of her love, as opposed to previously when he swooned at the great evil he was seeing. But he wakes to find himself being dragged through the waters of Lethe by Matilda. And Matilda is like floating on top of the water, which parallels to a story of Christ, but also she purges him by letting him drink from the river. And so he's finally cleansed of the sin and the weight of the sinful memory. And he arrives in front of the four nymphs who represent the four cardinal virtues, the philosophical virtues, as opposed to the three theological virtues. Okay, so the four philosophical virtues are virtues that anyone could have, right? But until you have religion, until you have Christianity, you can't have the three cardinal virtues. Okay, so the four philosophical virtues talk about how they were handmaidens from the beginning to Beatrice. They lead to Beatrice, just as we saw Virgil led Statius to Christianity, so these philosophical virtues lead to Christianity as well. But the greater virtues are the three theological virtues, faith, hope, and love. And they also make that connection to the stars we saw at the beginning of the Inferno. The 4 stars at the very first canto, and then the 3 stars later on, they make that connection with themselves. And then Dante sees 2 things before the end of this canto. The first, he looks into Beatrice's eyes. She's still veiled over the lower half of her face, at least. And he looks into her eyes, and he sees the reflection of the griffin, and he finally begins to understand the griffin, those 2 natures of the griffin, which represent the 2 natures of Christ, man and God. But he's looking into the eyes of Beatrice in order to do this, and Beatrice is standing for the bride, the church, and so it's the idea that by looking at the church and looking at the eyes of the church, he's able to understand God more. Now, it's not fully understand, because he still sees them as 2 separate things and not unified as one, as he will in heaven. We're still on a physical plane, and that's important. But it's the beginning of the idea. And then she removes her veil, and he gets to see her smile. And that's amazing! Her smile represents divine love, and so it's the smile of divine love smiling upon him is just mind-blowing. basically his head melts. And the beginning of Canto 32 is really just that description of his mind being blown by her smile. Her smile is going to continue on throughout Paradise, and we're going to talk about it a lot more. But the smile of divine love is really divine love shining down upon him, and that's going to be really significant. But even now, he's staring too much, because it's still just the physical representation of her smile, of divine love, instead of being the fully spiritual version that he's going to see in heaven. Everything here is still just physical nature. And so we're just about to shift from the physical perfection to the spiritual perfection, just as we've always been sort of talking about physical things and earthly things versus spiritual and theological things. And this is the turning point. And so these cantos get kind of heavy and thick because we're doing that sort of gear shift away from the physical into the spiritual. And so Garden of Eden is physical perfection. Everything is truly perfect, but it still is physical. And now we're about to shift to heavenly perfection, which is purely spiritual. Are you ready for paradise? But before we go there, we have a couple of other interesting things to see. So Canto 32 is a weird vision that is heavily symbolic. And we arrive at the tree in the garden. This is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. This is the tree from which Eve ate that caused the fall. And this is, again, significant. But then we have this huge reenactment with it. We have a vision with it. And all of it represents a lot about the fall of man, but also about the grace of God, and also about the corruption of the church. And that's the big point that he emphasizes, is the corruption of the church. Because Dante's still really frustrated after all of this, that the church could become so rotten. So the griffin, which is still representing Christ, we arrive at the tree, we weep over Adam's sin, they praise the griffin's nature, that he never ate from the tree, but then the griffin attaches himself and the wagon to the tree. And that has to do with the fact that in Dante's day, they talked about the true cross of Christ coming from the wood of this tree. And they all sing a hymn, and it's so beautiful that Dante's sort of senses are overwhelmed, and he falls asleep. But then he's woken again, and there's all these sort of parallels in the Bible of people being woken to more spiritual understanding, and there's a call for Dante to wake up and sort of rise from the dead. He's not dead, but he's being called to be spiritually awakened here. And when he's awakened, he sees that most of the pageant has gone on. At first, he just thinks Matilda's the only one left, and he's like, "Oh, where'd Beatrice go?" But there she is. She's sitting there waiting, and she has a few more things to show them before he goes on to paradise. She shows him a vision with the chariot, which is left there after the rest of the pageant has gone on, and the chariot at first is attacked by various animals. The first one is this eagle that swoops down and attacks it, and then a fox tries to sneak up but is driven away, and then the eagle comes back and covers the chariot with feathers, and then a dragon arrives and rides the chariot off, and the chariot turns into a monster, and then a giant comes up and beats it and drags it off. Complicated. There's a lot of ties into symbolism with Revelation. And the symbolism in Revelation of St. John talks about the way the church is caught up in the world of Rome. And Rome, or Babylon, Babylon is a symbol for Rome. The corruption of the Roman empires and the persecution that they inflicted upon the church are explored in the book of Revelation through deep symbolism. And Dante uses that same symbolism to describe symbolically the way the Roman Empire has influenced and corrupted the church. And ultimately, at first, there's the eagle attacking the chariot, which is the Roman Empire, the early Roman emperors who persecuted the Christianity, and then we had false teachings and the fox that snuck in, but then the eagle comes back and covers the chariot with feathers, which represent the way that the Roman empires finally accepted Christianity, but then gave tons of wealth to the church, which led the church to all kinds of political power and wealth, which corrupted it and made it evil. It turned it into a monster in the end, and then Satan was able to sort of have his way with it. And in the end, we have this giant that's dancing off with it, and it has the symbolism of corruption and of wantonness and of the way that the church leaders are really abusing their position. They're using it for evil. And there's also this sort of connection with the French government, and we have this sort of vision of the French kings that we saw earlier. Remember when Hugh was talking about his descendants and how they're going to sort of abuse the papacy, and ultimately we're gearing up for the Great Schism, which is coming before too much longer. It's after Dante here, but it's we see that shift from the church being stationed in Rome to being stationed in Avignon, and the French having too much of an influence and control over the church. Anyway, it's Dante's vision of the way the church has been corrupted. And so we see this vision of the perfect church in Beatrice, and the way she has reflected perfection, as opposed to the way wealth and power have corrupted the church leaders of Dante's day. So we still see that connection between earthly and heavenly things in this final part of Purgatory before we move up into paradise. But we arrive at the final canto of Purgatorio, and we talk with Beatrice. And Beatrice explains a little bit of the vision, and she also gives a prophecy which is really opaque, and she even tells Dante, you're not going to understand this. It is going to be beyond your understanding. And there's no real way to understand it. At least there isn't a really clear explanation of it in any notes that I've looked at yet. It's like purposefully obscure. And Dante's finally like broken of one of his worst habits. You notice that all the way throughout Purgatorio, every time Dante has a question, what he does is he goes, and like putters around until Virgil goes, okay, you can ask a question. You know, he's done that like so many times. He's always like wanting to speak, but he doesn't until Virgil's like, it's okay. Because so Virgil, they've gotten to the point in their relationship where Virgil's so used to when Dante wants to ask a question that like he's always like, you can ask a question, don't worry. And so Dante sort of continues in that, and it's partially the fact that he's just consumed the waters of Lethe and he hasn't yet imbibed the waters of Inoue, and he's sort of between those two. He's between the cleansing of his sin and his sinfulness, but he hasn't yet drank in the good, and so he's sort of empty and hollow. But also, he just doesn't ask the right questions, and Beatrice is not going to have that. She's much more direct than Virgil was about that. Virgil kind of had his back and was always willing to nudge him whenever he needed to ask a question and be like, you can ask a question now. But Beatrice doesn't. She gets onto them for that. First of all, she calls him up to stand by her, right next to Divine Love, so that he can see things and she can explain them as she goes along. She says, draw near, that you may, if I wish to speak to you as we move on, be better placed to hear. When I was, as I should be at her side, she said, dear brother, why are you not moved to question me as we go on? Come on! Open your mouth, tongue-tied, like one who knows his station is beneath that of the presences in which he stands and cannot drag his voice across his teeth. It's a great description. So did I, with a voice almost choked through, manage to say, my lady, all my need and all that is my good is known to you. And so, as sort of traditionally, he can't quite say what he wants to say. He hopes that she'll just kind of guide him and lead him along, kind of like he did with Virgil. And she to me, my wish is that you break the grip of fear and shame, and from now on no longer speak like one but half awake. And so once he drinks Inoue, he'll have that good within him and hopefully be able to speak better. But she reminds him, you gotta speak up. You gotta open that mouth of yours and stop being so shy about this. You've already been purged. So that's behind you. Now you need to move on for the good. And even though he's already been purged by Lethe and forgotten about it, she still reminds him that he neglected her at one point. And he's like, I don't remember that. She's like, that's because you drank Lethe, which just proves my point. They're still walking with the virtues, and they finally arrive at the last river, Inoue, and Dante is confused by it. He's forgotten it. And he, I guess, didn't really take that lesson at first. And everyone's like, Matilda, why didn't you tell him? And she says, I told him, and he forgot. But she gives him a drink, and finally he's purified and given the memory of goodness and filled with the good things. See Inoue there, lead him as is your custom to the brim of that sweet stream, and with its holy waters revive the powers that faint and die in him. Revive that good, fill him with the strength to do good. And she also calls Statius. We have a couple mentions of Statius throughout these cantos. It's really subtle. He's still there. He doesn't talk anymore because, again, his guidance is no longer necessary. It's really Beatrice who's doing the guiding from now on. And again, we have that sort of ineffable moment where he drinks the water. He can't describe it. It's too much. I don't have time to talk about it, he says. Reader, had I the space to write at will, I should, if only briefly, sing a praise of that sweet draught. Would I were drinking still. But I have filled all the pages planned for this, my second canticle, and art pulls at its iron bit with iron hand. I have to move on to the final section. And so he comes back, renewed and reborn and pure. After this, he is pure, perfect, and ready for the stars. And we end with the word stars. We always have to end with the word stars. At the end of each canticle, at the end of each book, he ends with the word stars. The first time, they climbed out of the inferno, and they looked up and they saw the stars. And this time, he is made pure, and he's ready to actually go there. So the first time he was just looking there, but we still had to climb. Now he's finally ready to go to the stars. As we mentioned last time, Matilda is the active one. She's the one who gives him the drink on both rivers. She is the soul in action. She's the good being done in action, as opposed to Beatrice, who is the reflective soul. And so she's the one who thinks and reflects and represents reflective good. They have different roles, just like Dante saw in his vision before this section. And now we're ready to go to Paradiso. So next time we'll pick up with Paradiso and we will do a set of notes over those. Harrison, this is great fun, and I hope I'm almost getting caught up. I think I'm still a bit behind, Harrison. Thank you so much for your patience with me. I'm finally to Paradiso, though, and I will get caught up with you soon, I hope. Thanks so much for your great notes. And I'll see you next time. In heaven. Bum 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 bum. Purgatorio. Bum 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 bum.